Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start the lecture now. Actually, we had one person here, but she looks like she exited the training. It's about 3:40. Uh, I'll actually wait for a couple more minutes before we start the training just to see if anyone shows up. Okay, thank you. All right, everyone, I'm going to go ahead and start the recording now. As of right now, no one is here, but that's why we'll record the session. Hopefully, you guys are watching the session at a later time. And if someone shows up later in the session, that's great too. So first of all, I just wanted to tell everyone my apologies again for the last training in which I did not show up. No excuse there. I wanted to make it up to everyone. Recently, my fiance and I just had a baby who just turned 3 months old. So life has been a little crazy with our new baby and holiday times and lack of sleep. And you know, I teach at Full Sail during my day job, run the chess club, and so it simply just slipped my mind. And I feel really bad, and I apologize for those people who came to the session and I didn't show up. Bad luck for sure, but that's why we're trying to make it up to you because chess is very important to us and don't want my oversight to hinder our relationship moving forward. So with that being said, hopefully you guys will accept my apologies and enjoy the session. Uh, for those of you who don't know, my name is Terrence Washington, and I'm the president and founder of the Orlando Chess Club. And some of you may have attended my session before. If you have, this will be a review for you. I ran 2 sessions last year, ran another session this year, and this will be the second session for this year, fourth session overall of our series. Welcome to Chess Coaching 101. Uh, because there are coaches of all different levels, the information encompassed in this lecture will go from the very, very basic all the way up to more advanced concepts. So let's get right into it. So today we'll cover some best coaching practices. We'll cover the basic rules of chess. During a live session, we would have breakout sessions, but since this is virtual, we'll just leave time for examples and questions. Basic strategy and tactics, basic checkmates with breakout sessions, full game. If you guys want to, log on to chess.com and play full game. Or we can just do more examples and then leave time for questions at the end. All right, so let's hop right into it. Best coaching practices. With my background in psychology, for those who don't know, I am a psychology professor at Full Sail University. My background is in clinical psychology. And I'm certainly not the first person to notice that there's a lot of psychology in chess, just like in any game that requires some skill and reading your opponent's mind per se. So there's psychology in chess, there's psychology in poker. This is a big part of the game. Also, the mentality of a chess player is very important, and we'll speak about both of those things right now. So, and you guys are teachers, so you know all about reinforcement, punishment, all that stuff, feedback, constructive criticism. So this is review for most of you all. But research indicates that positive feedback is more effective for pre-adolescent children. The negative feedback, or that constructive feedback of telling them how they can correct their behavior, becomes effective around the age of 12 or so. Now, the psychology behind that is pretty straightforward, and it's that the negative feedback requires more analysis, and thus it's harder for pre-adolescent children to follow. So if someone is a pre-adolescent student, it's much more easy for you to notice the times in which they're following the general principles, displaying sportsmanship, applying the lessons that you've taught them, and reinforce them for that, because then they know to continue that behavior. The positive feedback lets a child know to continue their current behavior. And that negative feedback, that constructive feedback, requires more critical thinking because they have to assess their current behavior, figure out how to change it, and figure out how to apply those changes. So that becomes more effective around 12 or so. If you have a 13-year-old kid, you can tell them, well, you did this incorrectly. The proper thing to do in this situation is to use the king and the queen in this formation to checkmate the opposing king. That would be effective for a 13-year-old. For a 7-year-old, not so much. So just make sure to tailor your coaching practices to the particular student that you're working with. Again, you guys are all teachers. You know this. Review. Some facts on chess that should shape your coaching style. Number one, chess is a very unforgiving game. So personal anecdote that I like to share with a lot of my students, if not all my students, is the story from one of my very first chess tournaments. So in one of my very first chess tournaments, I was playing a young lady, and I was winning the game. I was probably about 16 at the time. She was probably about 14. And as most kids do, and adolescents and teens, when you're winning, you get overconfident and you relax. I especially see this in younger kids who, sometimes their egos are very high. And you'll see this in your teenage students as well. I relaxed, got overconfident. I ended up losing that game after having an overwhelming advantage. I went on to win all the rest of the games in the tournament. And that one game cost me first place and several $100s as well. Chess is very unforgiving in that way. And it's much different from other sports. So let's say in football, you have an overwhelming advantage. Let's say you're up by 4 touchdowns. It's very hard to give up that advantage by making one mistake. Your opponent will still physically have to go down and score 4 touchdowns to catch up. Same thing in basketball. If you're up by 30, the other opponent has to score 30 straight to catch up. In chess, you can have an overwhelming advantage. Make one mistake, your king gets trapped. Make one mistake, you lose your queen. One mistake can ruin an overwhelming advantage. So chess is very unforgiving in that way. And that's hard for kids to deal with. I've seen many of games have drastic turnarounds at children's tournaments. Remember one game I went by, one kid had 2 or 3 queens on the board. The other kid didn't. I walk around maybe only 2 or 3 minutes later. Now the other kid's got 2 or 3 queens. And it's just like very unforgiving, and kids have a tough time dealing with that. So that's a fact of the game that should inform your coaching practice. And as we'll speak about soon, I'd much rather them learn the harsh lessons of chess than learn these lessons in real life. Another thing to consider is chess is too complex for the human mind to comprehend. But it's in our nature to want to know and understand everything. So I see it in my students very often where they'll be like, well, I understand what you're trying to do, or I understand what move to make. It's like, well, the very best players in the world often don't understand certain positions because chess is that complex. So we want to encourage a humility in our students to, if they don't know what to do in a particular situation, they acknowledge that they don't know. And really want to notice the lack of humility and try to encourage that humility, because chess is a very hard game. If you think you've got it, you don't. because even the best players in the world don't understand it fully, and even the best computers in the world don't understand it fully. So we truly believe that one of the best coaching practices is not to shield the children from the harsh realities of chess. As I said, we'd much rather them learn these lessons in chess rather than in real life. So one of the life lessons that we like to enforce in chess is vigilance. So if you look before you cross the street 99 times out of 100 and forget to look before you cross the street one time, that one time could cost you your life. And that's a harsh thing to say to a child, but it's much better than them going out and making that mistake. And chess, they teach you these harsh lessons in chess. Again, you can have an overwhelming advantage, you have three queens, but then you leave your king unprotected and you lose the game, right? So chess teaches these harsh lessons in a secure and safe environment, which then the children can go and apply to their life, whether it be vigilance or critical thinking or whatever it may be. So don't shield them from these harsh realities. And if you're playing them and you're a superior skill level than them, play your hardest, because you're just doing them a disservice if you're not playing your hardest. And match them up against more difficult opponents. If you have some standout talents who don't really have competition level, send them to our club or match them up against other schools. We can run tournaments for 3 schools, 2 schools, 5 schools in your area to match them up against other opponents who are at a strong level. Like I just said, always find better players for your children to play against. We meet at Valencia in Winter Park on Morse Boulevard, right off of 1792. We meet on Thursday nights from 6 to 9 p.m. Everyone's welcome. Make sure to continue to improve your own level. You should come out to the club yourself. You can play on Lead Chess, chess.com, books, and our YouTube channel, Orlando Chess Club on YouTube, has free lessons. Also, know all your basic checkmates: king and queen versus king and rook versus king and 2 bishops versus king and knight and bishop versus king, and king and pawn versus king. And we will work on some of these today. Fostering the following skills makes a good chess player and a great person: empathy, objectivity, and tenacity. Empathy is understanding what someone else is going through. And in chess, it's putting yourself in your opponent's shoes so that you can understand what they might be thinking, how they view their position, what plans they might be thinking of. And in the real world, we know the importance of empathy for social bonding. Then we have objectivity. Objectivity, you must be able to see the position as it is, not how you want it to be. Oftentimes we'll see a cool move that maybe only works if our opponent falls for it, but if they don't fall for it, it might be bad for us. But we might go for it anyways because my position is probably better anyways. No, you have to be accurate and cold and calculated and see the position as it is and know what the best thing to do is. Tenacity, it's very hard to win a chess game, and it gets even harder the more you improve, because the harder competition you play against, you know what you're doing, your opponent knows what they're doing. It's hard to win games, so you have to have that tenacity. That's the one core quality that really sets the current world champion apart from other chess players in his generation. He doesn't always have the supreme openings, or he might not always be the most dynamic player, but he's extremely, extremely tenacious, and he plays on in positions that other grandmasters might just agree to a draw. But he's extremely tenacious, and he wins a lot of those games based on his tenacity. Obviously, he's extremely skilled as well. But that tenacity nets him wins in other places that some grandmasters would never get. His name is Magnus Carlsen, by the way. He has a documentary. It's a great documentary to show your kids in chess club. Magnus Carlsen is his name. Since no one's here currently, obviously I can't field any questions, but if you guys do have any questions, please send them to orlandochessclub@gmail.com. You guys can also reach out to me personally on my cell phone, 407-721-4262. All right, so let's get into more of the actual core rules of chess and some basic strategy and tactics. So checkmate is obviously the objective of the game, but sometimes it's very unclear as to just a short, coherent understanding of what checkmate is. So checkmate is one's king is in check or in danger. Check is just a fancy word for danger. So it's when one's king is in check and there's no legal moves to escape check. Now, the key word there are no legal moves. It doesn't say no legal moves with the king, because if you're in check, you can move your king, but two other things you can do are capture the piece that it's putting you in check, or block the piece. So if you don't have any legal moves with your king, but you have a legal move with another piece that could stop the check in some way, you can go ahead and make that. But if you don't have any legal move with any pieces and your king is in check, that is checkmate and the game ends. The king does not leave the board in chess. The king is never captured. It is simply cornered. And once it's cornered and there's no way to get out, and it's in danger, that's when the game ends. Check is when one king is in danger by an opposing piece. It becomes checkmate if there are no legal moves to get out of check. So people say, well, how do you go about checkmating the king? Well, beginners you'll see will go right after the king. Now, logically, that makes sense. But in chess, it doesn't make sense. Much of chess is not going directly after the king. Much of chess is about controlling squares. So on a chessboard, there are 64 squares. And if you go directly after the king, that normally leaves your own king vulnerable if you do that right at the beginning of the game. And also, a lot of people just go right for the kill. They're only using one or two of their pieces, and the rest of their pieces are kind of just being useless. So chess is more about controlling squares. If there's 64 squares on the board and you control 50 of them, you're doing great. And chances are you have a better position, and then eventually you'll checkmate the king. So chess is about gaining these different advantages, controlling the center, which we'll talk about, initiative, material space, that you can later use to overwhelm the king. So it's a more patient approach. Think of it sort of like running a marathon, all right? If you run a marathon and you sprint right out of the gate, you're not going to have enough energy to finish the job. And chess is very similar. You go right after the king, normally fizzles out because you haven't prepared your pieces well enough, and then your opponent normally gets all the energy in the position or initiative, and they're able to overwhelm you. So in chess, there are three results: win, lose, draw. Win and lose, there's two ways to do both. You either checkmate your opponent, which will result in you winning. Your opponent can resign, which means they're basically giving up. You can lose by checkmate, and you can lose by giving up. There's several ways to draw. None of these will really come into play anytime soon. Maybe a couple of them. Threefold repetition is when the same position happens 3 times in a row. And when I say the same position, I mean the same exact position. And I stand corrected. Let me correct myself. So threefold repetition is when the same position happens 3 times. It doesn't have to be consecutive. It's definitely more likely if it's consecutive. But the 3 positions, if the same exact position occurs 3 times on the board, then the game is drawn. That means every pawn is in the same place, every pieces in the same place, the kings are in the same place, the queens are in the same place, bishops, knights, everything is the same place 3 times. Either side can claim a draw. There's draw by stalemate, which means someone's king is trapped, meaning it has no legal moves. However, it's not in check, and there are no legal moves. And we'll cover this because that's confusing for some people, especially at the beginning, and confusing for honestly me and other people at times because it's a rule that doesn't quite make sense. 50 move rule, which means at any point in the game, if there are 50 consecutive moves, it happens. And by the way, in chess, white moves, black moves, that's considered 1 move, not 2 moves. So 50 consecutive moves happen, and there are no pawn moves or captures, the game is considered a draw. Players can agree to a draw. Those situations that happen called perpetual check, where one side maybe has a disadvantage, but they can continually check the opposing king, and there's no way the opposing king can get out of check. There's never a position that results in checkmate, but basically you're just chasing the king around, and he's never going to get killed, but he also can't ever escape the chase. And then there's something called insufficient mating material. So for instance, if you get down to a position that has a king, a bishop just versus a lone king, there's no possible way the king and the bishop can win versus a lone king. So that's called insufficient mating material. You don't have enough material to checkmate the opponent. So this is another very important aspect of chess that a lot of people don't know about, especially when they first learn. But there is a point system, which is more just a metaphorical point system that helps you understand the value of each piece so that you know if you're going to give away a piece in exchange for one of your opponent's piece or 2 of your opponent's piece or 3, or you're going to give up 3 pieces for 2 of his or whatever it may be. It helps you understand if the exchange of pieces is a good thing or a bad thing for you. That's all it does. So you can't win or lose a game based on points. It just helps you understand the strength of your pieces versus the strength of your opponent's pieces. So the queen has a value of 9. The rook has a value of 5. And the next one is slightly controversial. Some people are taught that the bishop has a value of 3, but a lot of grandmasters agree that the bishop is slightly stronger than the knight in a lot of situations, so they give it a value of 3.25. So 3 or 3.25 is viable, but I do believe that the bishop is slightly stronger, and many much stronger players than myself believe the same thing. So bishop gets 3.25. Knight's worth 3. Pawn's worth 1. King is invaluable because if you lose the king, you lose the game. So the reason why this is important is because it helps you understand the value of exchanges. So if I bring up my chessboard here, let me clear the board. So if there's a situation on the board let's say there's a situation on the board like this. All right. Oops, sorry, let me start over real quick. Sorry about the delay, guys. I clicked the wrong button. So there's a situation like this on the board. Obviously, the strongest piece on the board is the queen. Okay. So white has a queen, a rook. Black has 2 rooks. We can even do this. Let's add this. So it's completely equal. Queen and 2 rooks versus queen and 2 rooks. Okay. So if it's white to move, white has the option of using his queen to take the rook. But since we know that rooks move horizontally, that would mean on the next move, black could use his rook to take the queen. But what we need to notice is that white can move his rook all the way down at the end of the series, and white would be able to get 2 rooks in exchange for 1 queen. Now, here's where the point system is important. We're dealing with different pieces. When you're exchanging the same piece of bishop for a bishop and knight for a knight, it's easy to understand that that's an equal trade. But when you're dealing with different pieces, you have to know if you're doing well or not. So in this exchange, I take 1 rook, he gets my queen, I take a 2nd rook. So I was able to get 2 rooks and give up a queen. Now let's look at our point system. I gave up 9 points. I gave up my queen. So I gave him $9. But he gave me 2 5s in return. He gave me $10 in return. So that is a good trade for me. And now in this end game, I am slightly better because the value of my pieces are 5 plus 5. The value of his piece is 9. So I have 10 versus 9. So I have an advantage in this position. So that's why the point system is so valuable. Okay. You have a situation where, we go back to the board editor. If you have a situation like this, notice some kids just like drawing, by the way, which is not bad, but if you have a winning position, no need to draw. You know, I might go ahead and, let me just take this bishop, right? In reality, you have an advantage. This piece is worth 5. This piece is worth 3. This piece can do more things than this piece can. All right? So no need to give up your rook for the bishop. Try to win the game because you just gave up 5 points for 3 points. This is why the point system is so valuable. The chessboard has coordinates on it. There's 64 squares on an 8x8 coordinate. The vertical columns are called rings. Sorry, files. So the B file, the H file, the G file, the E file, etc. The 1 through 8 are called ranks. This is the 2nd rank here. This is the 4th rank. I'm using an actual chessboard here so I can highlight. This would be the 4th rank here. As you can see, by the number 4 here, this would be the D file. This helps to communicate more effectively. The jargon helps communicate more effectively. You know, rather than saying, oh, move your rook to F3, you could say your rook needs to be on the F file. Or the F file is open. Or your pawns need to be on the 4th rank. Pieces are placed on the board in the standard position. It's very important that the white pieces are on 1 and 2. The black pieces are on 7 and 8. And this is because the queen always belongs on the d file. And if you set the black pieces up on 1 and 2 and the white pieces up on 7 and 8, it gets a little bit confusing because we like to teach kids that the queen goes on the d file because she has diamonds in her crown. As you can see, the queen is shaped like a crown. She has diamonds in her crown, so she belongs in the d file. In order for that to stay consistent, the white pieces have to be on 1 and 2, and the black pieces have to be on 7 and 8. And when the kids start to notate or write down their games, this is extremely important that the pieces are on 1 and 2 for white and 7 and 8 for black. Queen always goes on her own color, so the white queen always belongs on a white square, dark queen always belongs on a dark square. The bishop. So let's start with the rook. The rook moves like a plus sign, up and down, left and right, as many squares as he wants to go. He cannot change directions within one move. He cannot jump over pieces. When he captures a piece, he occupies the square that the piece once took. Obviously, he can't capture his own pieces, so a white rook can only capture black pieces. A black rook can only capture white pieces. It's not like checkers where you jump over. You simply land on the same square. The bishop moves as many squares as she wants, but she only moves diagonally. She cannot change directions within the course of one move. She would have to wait for her next turn to change directions. And because she only moves diagonally, she starts on a dark square, so you can never get to a light square, because as you can see, in every direction, diagonally, it will be the same colored square. So a dark colored bishop never good on a light colored square, and a light colored bishop never good on a dark colored square. So both white and black start with a light squared bishop and a dark squared bishop. White will have one light squared bishop, one dark squared bishop. We go back to the previous example. White will have one of each. So white has a light squared bishop here on f1, dark squared bishop here on c1. Black has a dark squared bishop on f8, and a light squared bishop on c8. The queen is a combination of the rook and the bishop. The queen can move up and down, left and right, as many squares as she wants, just like the rook, but she can also move diagonally like the bishop. So you combine them two together, you get the queen. The king is just a much slower version of the queen. He can do everything the queen can do, just at a much slower pace, only one square at a time. So he can move left and right, up and down, diagonally, but only one square at a time. So he's very slow. The knight has the trickiest move of them all, and it's best shown on a board. So I'm going to get my board out again. So the knight moves like an L, okay? So the knight always covers 3 squares. I should say travels across 3 squares. So the knight goes 2 in one direction and 1 in another direction. Or if you'd like to think about it, 1 in one direction, 2 in another direction. You can think about it that way, whichever way is easier for you to conceptualize. So in this particular knight, can go to this square. It could also go to this square. It could also go to this square over here. Sorry, I don't know why it's not letting me move pieces. Let me double check what's going on here. All right, let me just make sure we're good here. There we go. All right, so this knight could go to this square, it could go to this square, go to this square. You can see all the 8 squares that it can go to. They're all 2 and 1, right? So we can think about it like this. 2 to the right and 1 down. This is why the knight's so confusing. It can go in so many different directions. Let's say 1 up and then 2 over. Let's say 2 up, 1 to the right. Let's say 2 up, 1 to the left. Let's say 1 over, 2 down. Let's say 2 over, 1 up. Say 2 down, 1 over. All right? The only thing you can't do is like go 2 in one direction and then diagonal in a different direction. Can't do that. So always change the direction, up and down, left and right, but never moves diagonally. So you're never going to go 2 vertical and 1 diagonal. It's always going to be 2 vertical, 1 horizontal, or 2 horizontal, 1 vertical, or whatever it may be. One thing you'll notice is that a knight always alternates colors. If it starts on a white square, it'll land on a dark square. Starts on a dark square, it'll land on a light square. That's how you know you're doing it correctly. There's no other way to do it. All right, pawns. Pawns are interesting because they have unique move sets. From its starting position, so for white, if the pawns are on the 2nd rank, and black, if the pawns are on 7th rank, from its initial position, a pawn has the option, each pawn has the option on its initial move to move 1 or 2 squares. So on the first move, I can move this pawn 1 square, or I can move 2 squares. This rule applies to each pawn. So even though I've already moved this pawn 2 squares, I can still move, let's say, this pawn 2 squares because it's on its initial square. It's on its initial square. Hasn't moved yet. Now let's say we have a situation like this. I can't move this pawn 2 squares. Why not? Because it's not on its initial square. Its initial square was here. It is here now. It only can move 1 from now on out. But this pawn can move 2. This pawn can move 2. This pawn can move 2. This pawn, this pawn. For black, this pawn, this pawn, and this pawn. This pawn and this pawn. This pawn can't because it's not on its initial square. This pawn cannot either because it's not on its initial square, and this pawn cannot either because it's not on its initial square. Pawns only capture diagonally, so the only piece that moves one way, which is vertically, but captures diagonally. Strange, I know. So we have a situation like this. I can normally move my pawn straight, but since I cannot capture straight, these pawns are stuck. I can only capture diagonally. This is how a pawn captures. Captures diagonally only. All right, a little bit of history just described en passant. So thousands, well, not even necessarily thousands, but let's say 500-600 years ago, pawns could only move 1 square at a time. They didn't have the option to move 2 moves on its initial move, 2 squares on its initial move. So 500-600 years ago, pawns could only move like this. Then they introduced the 2-move rule, and then they realized it caused some initial situations. Namely being, there are situations like this that can happen where white, if he doesn't want to get into a battle, instead of moving here, old rule, he would have to move here, right? Because he can only move one square at a time. The new rule came in, and it's like, okay, he's on this initial square, he can move 2 squares. But with the new rule, they realized that this game of battle, one side could just choose not to battle by moving 2 squares next to your pawn, right? I'm just going to avoid the battle. I'm just going to bypass you. So then they instituted a rule called en passant, which was, okay, if a pawn moves 2 squares, it has to be 2 squares. If a pawn does a 2 mover, and it moves directly adjacent to an enemy pawn, the enemy pawn can capture that pawn as if it had only moved 1 square. So this is a weird looking move. Watch this. Let's rewind. Watch this one more time. It's the only time you're capturing a piece by landing on a different square that the piece is on. Very strange looking move. The pawn is here, but I'm going to capture it by moving here. Now, this is a very complicated rule. Caveat number 1, it's got to be a 2 mover. So for example, if this is the position here, let's say your pawn is already here. You move it next to my pawn. I cannot capture you. It's not legal because it was not a 2 mover. It was only a 1 mover. So it has to be a 2 mover. Number 2, my choice to exercise en passant, which is French for in passing. Let me pull up the slide again so you can see the spelling. En passant. French for in passing. If I choose to exercise it, it is an option. But if I want to exercise that option, I must do it immediately. So for example, white just moved his pawn here. If I want to capture the pawn en passant, I must do it now. If I wait a turn, as you can see, the computer will not let me do it because the window has closed. So en passant must be exercised on the very first chance it can be exercised, if you choose to exercise it. The rule is good with only pawns. Sometimes you'll see people wanting to en passant with different pieces. So let's say there's a bishop here, right? Some people want to try to en passant bishop. No, it only works with 2 pawns. Okay, but it works for both sides. So you can en passant me, but then I can en passant you as well. It was a 2 mover. It's directly next to my pawn. I can take you as if it only moved 1 square. But if I want to do it, I must do it immediately. If I wait a turn, I can't do it. So that's en passant. This is not some special rule. This is an official rule of chess. This is how chess is played. Just because an opponent doesn't know about it doesn't mean it's not a real rule. It's a real rule. The 4th thing a pawn can do is promote. When a pawn reaches the opposite side of the board, the other end of the board completely, it can turn into a knight, bishop, a rook, or queen. A common misconception here is that it has to be an already captured piece. This is not true. If you have a queen on the board already, you can get a 2nd queen. You can get a 3rd queen, a 4th queen, a 5th queen. You got 2 bishops on the board, you can get a 3rd bishop, a 4th bishop, a 5th bishop. It doesn't have to be an already captured piece. If there is not a piece available, you can declare that the pawn is the piece that you want it to be. So let's say you want a 3rd knight on the board. Your pawn reaches the end of the board. I want another knight. There's not another knight of your color to put on it. So you have the white pieces. You can't find another white knight to put on the board. You simply declare, I'm promoting this pawn to a knight. It is now a knight, and move it as such. Generally speaking, by the time a pawn is promoted, there is a piece that will be available to be replaced on the board, and you can use that captured piece. But again, you don't have to pick a captured piece. You can pick anything you want as long as it's a bishop, a knight, a rook, or a queen. Next, we get to castling. Castling is a situation in which you Get your king out of the center of the battlefield. Just like in war, you don't want your king in the middle of the battlefield. So we castle our king. Okay? Castling is a special move because it's the only move in which you get to move two pieces at once, and it's the only time your king can move two squares at once. Here's how you do it. First, you make sure there's no pieces in between your king and your rook. Second, you ask yourself, have I moved my king before? If you have moved your king, you can no longer castle. If you have not moved your king, but you have moved the rook in which you are intending to castle, you cannot castle. Both pieces in the exchange of castling must have been unmoved previously. This must be their initial move. So I have not moved my king, I have not moved my rook. I will now take my king and move it two squares. What? And then the rook will be moved on the opposite side of the king. Now castling can be obtained on either side of the board. So let's say I want to castle on this side of the board. I can do it. As you notice, there's more space on this side of the board. This is called queenside castling or long castling because it happens on the side of the board in which the queen initially started. This is called short castling or kingside castling. Even though there's more space on this side of the board, I'm still only going to move my king two squares. The rook will come on the other side. Now there's several caveats to this. Again, if you've moved your king, you no longer can castle the rest of the game. If you move your rook on the side of the board that you want to castle with, you can no longer castle. If there are any pieces in the way, you can't castle. If you're currently in check, you can't castle to get out of check. That doesn't seem logical. You should be able to castle out of check, but you can't. That's the rule. If your king is in check, if your opponent says, all right, you're in check, you try to castle, not allowed. You cannot pass through check to get to castling. That one's a little hard to explain, but can be explained quickly if we follow this example here. Now it's white's move. Oh, computer's not letting me castle. Why not? Who can guess why? Well, it's because of this bishop here. This bishop here, think of it as a sniper. It could move all the way across the board. So if this was real war, would you really send your king through a square in which it could be captured? No. Even though it's ending up on this square, here, it's still not legal because your king would have to pass through danger, harm's way, to get there. So that's called passing through check. It is not allowed. If you're trying to castle, you cannot pass through check. More obvious is you can't end up in check once you've castled. So if I want to try to castle on this side, I can't because my king would end up in the path of the queen. But good news is, since I haven't moved my king or my rook, I can castle on this side of the board. All right? Lots of rules to it. So if we look at some examples, in the first example, the white king is already in check. The rook on e4 here, putting the king in check. So I cannot castle because one of the rules is if you are in check, you cannot castle on that move. So even though I would be not in check at the end of my turn, since I'm in check, I cannot castle. In the second example, let's assume the king hasn't moved and neither rook has moved. I can't castle short or castle on the king side because as the green square on g1 is highlighted, my king would be attacked by that bishop. So I can't end up in check when I castle. But I can castle on the other end, castle long on that end, and that's completely fine because I'm not passing through check, I'm not ending up in check, and I'm not currently in check. The last one, I can castle short on the king side, but I can't castle on the long side because my king would have to pass through g1 in lime green. It'd have to pass through danger to get there. Now, the point of castling, again, if this is warfare, do you want your general right in the middle of the battlefield? No, you want him in the corner. You want him so that no one can come up behind him and attack him that way, surrounded by his own men. As we talked about, capturing occurs when you land on the same square as an opposing piece. Kings are never ever captured when they're checkmated, the game ends. There's lots of illegal moves that happen in chess. But if you know the rules that kings aren't captured, that can help you understand what to do in certain illegal moves. So in the first example here, the king cannot move to either one of the squares marked or indicated by the red X. And that's because the bishop is attacking those squares. Now, what do you do if your opponent moves to those squares? You simply say that's an illegal move. What most kids do is they try to take the king. As I've said numerous times, kings are never taken in chess. Illegal moves are not allowed. So if your opponent makes an illegal move, you simply say, you made an illegal move. If there is a legal move with the piece that you initially touched, you must still make a legal move with that piece. So since you touched the king, you can't move to either one of the squares indicated by the red X, but you did still touch the king, you have to move your king somewhere. If there are no legal moves with the piece you touched and everything is an illegal move with the piece that you touched, then only then can you move a different piece. But when a legal move happens, it needs to be identified immediately, and it must be removed, taken back, and a legal move with the same piece that you touched, if possible, must be made. One can never move into check. One can never remain in check at the end of your turn. So if you're in check, you make a move and you're still in check, that's an illegal move. And if you can't figure out a way to get out of check, you might be in checkmate. Just going based on that rule, one can never move into check, then it's clear that kings can never be adjacent to each other, because that must mean that one king put themselves in check. Kings can never be adjacent to each other. So illegal moves. Traditionally, you must move the piece that you first touched, unless it's an illegal move. The opposing player notifies his opponent that a legal move was made. The illegal move is taken back, and a legal move is put in its place. So if you're playing at home, I would recommend, if you want to just play a practice game, play with pawns, rooks, and kings only. Then master that, and then gradually add more pieces. All right, so this brings us to basic strategy. In the opening, especially, but really throughout the game, the most important squares on the board are the central four squares. The central four squares are important because of what we taught on the first or second slide when we started talking about the technical aspects of chess, which is that chess is about controlling squares. It's not about going directly towards the king. It's about controlling squares. And the best way to control squares is by controlling the center. Let's look at a very simple example to illustrate this. Let's take the most powerful piece on the board, the queen. If we place the queen in the center of the board, and we mark all of the squares that the queen attacks, or i.e. can travel to, we will mark 27 squares. Oh no. Let me try to do this over without messing up this time. So if you'd like to check my math, this queen here can travel to 27 squares. All right, so we got 1, 2, 3, 4, right? 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27. 27 squares it can attack by being in the center of the board. Now if we take that very same piece, put it on the edge of the board, it attacks 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. So on the side of the board, it only controls 21 squares, but in the center of the board, it controls 27 squares. It controls 6 more squares, which may not seem a lot, but that's very significant in chess. It controls 6 more squares simply by being in the center of the board. Now let's check the knight. The knight is the most obvious reason why you need your pieces in the center of the board. In the center of the board, the knight can go to 8 squares. On the side of the board, the knight can go to 4 squares. And lowly old knight in the corner can only go to 2 squares. So having pieces in the center gives your pieces the best scope that they can have. And remember, chess is about controlling squares. So if we go to our analysis board, we see a lot of beginners make side moves here. It's not that these moves are bad, it's just that they don't follow the general principles. If these are the most important squares on the board, we want to attack those squares. So let's take some innocent looking moves. Let's say white moves here, black moves here, white moves here, black moves here, white moves here, black moves here, white moves here. All right, now let's see. White has the same amount of pawns as black. Black has the same amount of pieces as white. But if I turn on this computer here, we will see white has an advantage. If the engine ever loads here. And the reason is, once this engine loads, it's because I'm dominating the center with my pawns. And I can still bring my knights into the game. Whereas you want to be able to play your knight here. But if you do, I'll happily take your knight. Give a pawn worth 1 point for a knight worth 3 points. I'll happily do that. Right? This is why controlling the center with your pawns and pieces is so important. You want your pawns stopping your opponent's pieces from developing. You want your pieces, when they can, to get into a central square so they can attack as many squares as possible. This engine doesn't want to turn on. So the central 4 squares are important for that reason. A piece in the center of the board has the most control it can have, and a pawn in the center of the board can stop your opponent's pieces from moving. In the opening in particular, you want to control the center. You want to develop your pieces, meaning getting your pieces off of the back row. And you want to castle your king because you don't want your general in the center of the board when the battle ensues. So that's basic opening strategy. Middle game strategy is all about understanding strengths, weaknesses, and imbalances. So here we have a boxing analogy. You have 2 boxers that are the same height, weight, they've had the same amount of previous experience. They have the same reach, the same age. I don't know if I already said that. You'd expect the outcome to be a draw. But when you introduce differences, one fighter is taller than the other, but maybe the other fighter is faster. Maybe one fighter is stronger than the other. Maybe one's better with a right hand, one's better with a left hand. When you introduce those differences, that's when the matchups happen. And it becomes clear that either side could win, either side could lose. So these differences that we can create on the chessboard increase the chances of winning, right? If you have two bishops and they have two knights, the more you learn about chess, you understand that two bishops want a really open board, which means not a lot of pawns in the way. The center of the board is wide open. This is because that bishops like long diagonals. And if bishops can have an open board, then you have two bishops versus two knights, then you want to make sure your two bishops are on the open board. So this is one reason why the differences and knowing why the differences are important can help you win a game. Another thing is what we call an open file. An open file is where there's no pawns blocking it. So this file here for black is a half open file. There's no pawns of blacks blocking it. Typically, when you see an open file here, you want to put your pieces, rooks, on that file to help control all the squares on the file. So understanding strengths and weaknesses will help you in the middle game, whether it be, hey, my opponent's king doesn't have any pieces guarding it. Maybe I should see if I can attack it. Or, hey, he's got a piece that's not defended by anything, or a pawn that's not defended by anything. Maybe I should attack that. The middle game is all about understanding those differences, those strengths and weaknesses, and exploiting them. The end game is all about either promoting a pawn, checkmating your opponent, using your material advantage to basically overwhelm your opponent and get a winning endgame. Endgames happen when there aren't many pieces left on the board. Generally, we consider it an endgame if the queens come off the board. But endgames are all about taking those differences, turning them into advantages. That's what you did in the middle game, and then once you have that advantage, converting that advantage in the end game. Welcome, Kelly. All right, so we brings us to basic tactics. The first basic tactic we have is a pin. A pin is when we have a very valuable piece that's hiding behind a less valuable piece. So in this situation here, we have two pins. If we look at this example over here, the first pin is this knight here on e6 is pinned to the king. If the knight ever moves, this would be an illegal move because it would expose black's own king to check. And we know that we can't ever put our own king in check. So this knight is pinned to the king. Because the king is very valuable, the knight cannot move. This is called an absolute pin, meaning that it would break the rules. It would literally break the rules of chess for it to move because it would put your own king in check. So the knight can't move because the black king would be in check. That's an absolute pin. Here on the B file, we have a relative pin, which means there's no rule saying the knight cannot move, but if it did, this very valuable piece hiding behind it, the queen, would be taken. So if this knight moves anywhere, the queen, boom, is taken off the board. So this is a relative pin. You can move if you want to, but it's not advisable. All right. So let's look at some examples of pins here. Okay. So let me get some puzzles up here. All right, so in this position here, the knight here is pinned to the rook because the rook is more valuable than the knight. And the knight, if the knight ever moves anywhere, as we can see, the queen that's sitting currently on d5 can go ahead and take that rook that's highlighted in red. So the knight is currently pinned. The proper jargon is the knight is pinned to the rook by the queen. But the good news is we don't have to worry about that pin in this position because we can just go ahead and checkmate the king. In this case, we will pin this pawn to the king. This pawn would love to take this pawn here, but that would expose the king to check. As you can see, the rook would be checking the king. So we pin the pawn to the king. King moves, and on the next turn, we can simply just take the pawn. In this position here, we put the king in check. The bishop blocks, but now the bishop is in an absolute pin, which means it cannot move because if the bishop ever moves, the king is in check. So it would break the rules for the bishop to move. And now we can make this beautiful move here. And on the next move, we're either going to take the bishop or we're going to queen our pawn. So pins are very powerful. The skewer is very similar to the pin, except the skewer is the opposite. In the pin, the more valuable piece is hiding behind the less valuable piece. And the skewer, the more valuable piece is in front of the less valuable piece. And the more valuable piece is forced to move out of the way, and the less valuable piece is taken. So in this example here, we have a king that's more valuable than the queen. Even though the queen is more powerful, the king is more valuable because if you lose him, you lose the game. King is in check. Once the king moves, because the king is being attacked by the bishop, no matter where the king moves, queen is taken on the next move. So let's look at some puzzles involving the skewer. So in this case here, we have this beautiful sequence of moves. We put the king in check. The king goes to the only square he can go to. Then we play this move here. The king is more valuable than the rook. But the king is forced to move because now the king is in check. You might be asking, well, why can't the king just take the rook? The king can't take the rook because the rook is defended by this bishop right here. So the more valuable piece has to move out of the way, and we go ahead and take the less valuable piece. That's a skewer. Let's look at another example of a skewer. In this case here, we have a queen and rook that are on the same line, we are able to attack the queen. Oh, I guess this one's wrong. Let me look at this a little bit closer. Oh, I see. So we have a king, a rook, and a rook all on the same line. If we take the queen, now we can move the rook all the way down to the end, forcing the more valuable piece to move. The king is more valuable than the rook because we can't ever lose the king. And then we take the rook on the next move. Again, skewers when the more valuable piece is shielding the less valuable piece. The more valuable piece is forced to move. You take the less valuable piece behind it. Let's look at one more. Again, the same theme. We put the king in check here. Once the king moves out of the way, we take the less valuable piece behind it. Any questions on that? I'm glad you're here, Kelly. I've been talking to myself uh, for about an hour. And welcome, Mrs. Myers and Miss Daly. Welcome. Glad you guys can make it. The previous part of the lecture has been recorded, so no worries on that. All right, next we have a fork. Thank you, Kelly. A fork is when one piece attacks two other pieces. So in the example on the left here, how many forks do you see in this situation? We have two. We have the pawn forking the two rooks. The pawn is attacking both rooks when one moves, the other rook is taken, and the knight is forking the rook and the king. Okay? So that's two forks. It's a powerful thing because when you can use one piece to attack multiple other pieces, this means you're utilizing your pieces to the best of their abilities. Let's look at some puzzles involving forks. All right. So in this situation here, we can make this wonderful move here. I love this move here. This combines two things we've already learned. This combines a pin and a fork. Does anyone want to take a stab at the right move? I'll give you some time. Black to move. Where should black move his piece? And for those of you watching the recording, I'll give you a couple seconds to look at it as well. Where to move the black knight, Miss Kelly? So here's how I like to think about a pin. We know that this pawn here is pinned because if it were ever to move out of the way, the king would be exposed by the queen. So we know this pawn is pinned. Therefore, this square is not being attacked by anything. So I can move my knight here, put the king in check, but also it's attacking the queen. Right? Beautiful move. Put you in check, you can't take because that exposes your king to check. You must move the king somewhere, and then I take the queen on the next move. So that combines two tactics together, the pin and the fork. Again, the pin is where a less valuable piece is shielding a more valuable piece, and the less valuable piece cannot move. And a fork is when you're attacking two pieces with one piece, two or more pieces with one piece. All right, let's look at our next one. Who can identify the fork in this position? It's white to move and win a very valuable piece. Yes. So in that last situation, Miss Kelly, taking the queen with the knight, and even if our knight can be captured, it's definitely worth it because the knight is only worth 3, and we're getting something that's worth 9 in return, which is the queen. So who can see the fork in this position here? So the fork actually is with the bishop this time. We move our bishop here, puts the black king in check. Black king is forced to move. And then what do we do on the next move? Take the rook on the next move. Check, take the rook. We can't make a queen just yet because the rook would take. So we got to take the rook off the board first, and then we have an overwhelming advantage. All right, next one. Very common tactic here. The pawn is only one square from becoming a queen, or whatever piece you want. I will move the rook down here, attacking both of them. What will I do if black takes my rook with his rook? Right. And if he moves the king, I simply take his rook. So no matter what he does, I have a plan. So the fork is I'm attacking two pieces at once. If he takes my rook, I take his rook and get a second queen. If he moves his king, I take his rook. It's good to always have a plan for both options. All right. So this is a pin and a fork. If we move our rook here, there's nothing black can do to save his knight. He can't move his knight. Why can't he move his knight, guys? Why can't he simply just move his knight away? Right. It exposes the king. The king is pinned. Correct. Thank you, Miss Myers and Miss Kelly. But the rook is also attacking two pieces at once, so it's a fork as well. So it's a pin and a fork. No matter what he does, we take the knight on the next move. All right, our next tactic is discovered attack. Discovered attack. All right, so let's set up the position. This is one of my favorite positions that I teach in this training. All right, a discovered attack is when one piece moves, exposing its friend behind it. So think of it like in the military. One officer might go in first, and several officers might follow behind. And if the one officer that's in the front moves out of the way, it exposes all his buddies behind, and they can overwhelm the enemy. So a discovered attack is when I'm going to move one of my pieces to make one of my other pieces stronger. So if we look at this position here, what ideas do you guys have in this position? What should white move in this position? Where should I move the bishop to, guys? All right, so we have g6. And Miss Myers, what is your idea to move your bishop to g6? Because it's a great idea. So I want to see if you can articulate what your idea is. Black has to move the king, correct? Because he would be in check. And then I take the queen. So the only problem with that is this. If I move the bishop, you're in check. Okay? But the problem is you can take my rook by getting out of check. I'm no longer in check. And even if you take the queen, I'm still winning because my piece is worth 5 and your pieces together, 3 plus 1, are only worth 4. You have the right idea, but there's a better move with the bishop. And this is what I like about chess. It's both frustrating, but then you see certain positions that are absolutely beautiful. So the frustrating part about this is you're doing everything right. You're moving a piece that attacks a queen, and at the same time, you're putting the king in check, and somehow it still doesn't work out. But it's the right idea. You just have to figure out the best place to move the rook. Or sorry, the best place to move the bishop. I'll let it percolate for a little bit. Ah, Mrs. Myers says bishop to f3. What's your idea there, Mrs. Myers? Right. So we, it's a discovered attack because we're moving our bishop to make our rook stronger. Now, in this scenario, we don't have to give up anything at all and we win the queen. Now we have 5 plus 3, which is 8, plus 1 is 9, versus 5. Now we have an overwhelming advantage. Discovered attack. All right, so now let's do some review on the difference between check and checkmate. So I'm going to set up some scenarios here, and I want you guys to tell me, or you ladies, I should say, to tell me if the situation is check, checkmate, or stalemate. All right, so the first situation here is this situation. All right, it's white's turn in this situation. Okay, it's white's turn in this situation. It's white to move. Is this situation checkmate, stalemate, or check? Stalemate, that's correct. And why is it stalemate? Nowhere to go. The king can't move in a check, but you're missing a valuable piece because both those things also apply to checkmate. In checkmate, there's nowhere to go. And in checkmate, there's nowhere that you can move your king either. So why is this not checkmate? There we go. The king is not in check. So there's no legal moves, but the king is not in check. What's this? White to move. Checkmate. Exactly. How come I can't take the queen? Can't take the queen because it'd be putting my king in check. Exactly. All right. What's this? If there's just two kings only on the board, it'll be called a stalemate, to answer your question, Kelly. That's correct, Miss Myers. It's checkmate. How come the king can't move to this square? Bishop, exactly. All right. Uh, what's this? So this is actually checkmate as well. So if we pay attention to the board, 7 and 8, which means the black piece is started on this side of the board, which means this pawn is heading in this direction here, which means this pawn controls this square right here, which means my king can't move there. Tricky question, right? I can't move here because the pawn can take. I can't move here because the queen can take, and I can't move here because the queen can take. So if you look at where the 7 and 8 are, the 7 and 8 is where the black pieces start, and the 1 and 2 is where the white pieces start. So that means this pawn started on this side of the board. Yeah. All right, what's this position here? Right, simply check because even though I don't have any legal moves with my king, I can simply take the piece that's putting me in check. Good job, guys. All right. Now that leads us to basic checkmates, which I've gone over before, but fundamentals are very important. How many of you who are here now know how to checkmate with a king and queen versus a king? All right, so this is one of the very most basic skills that you can learn. I'll make you a deal. If I can teach you this skill in 3 minutes, I want you to go ahead and teach it to your students in 3 minutes as well. The skill is difficult on the surface, but if you follow three simple rules, actually, yeah, just really three simple rules, you can learn this technique. Deal? All right, so here we go. So the first thing you do is you simply look at the opposing king. So in this situation, you'll have the white pieces, I'll have the black pieces. In this situation, all you have to do is look at the opposing king. Then you play make believe. You ask yourself, if this king were a knight, it's a weird question, where could it move? Do we agree that if this king were a knight, it can move here, 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 and here? Do we agree with that situation? That if this king were a knight, it can move to all those squares. Those highlighted squares are what we call knight's shadows. All you have to do is pick one of those knight shadows, and wherever the king moves, you stay in that same pattern with the king. So if I were to choose this square here, this square is in the upper right hand corner to the king. I always want to stay in that orientation to the king. A different way to think about it is wherever the king moves, I mimic that move. Essentially, it's a way of cornering the king. So if we look at it, if we stay a knight's move away from the king, we're essentially creating a box that the king cannot escape from. All right, so staying a knight's move away creates a box that the king can never escape from. Wherever the king moves, we mimic the move. So if the king moves here, what square do we move our queen to? D5. We move here, where do we move our king? Sorry, queen. Where do we move our queen to? Bingo. What about here? Bingo. Here? Bingo. Here? Boom. Here? Bingo. And here? I tricked you. Because now it's black's move. What can he do? Can he move anywhere? Is he in check? No. So stalemate. So rule number one is knight shadow. And you mimic wherever the king moves to. Rule number two is as soon as the king enters, the opposing king enters the corner, the very corner square, you don't move your queen. You bring your king 2 squares diagonal to the king. So rule number one, night shadow. Rule number two, as soon as the king goes in the corner, stop moving your queen and bring your king 2 squares diagonal to the corner. Boom. The reason is the king is already trapped. He can only move to these 2 squares. So he just has to shuffle back and forth and wait for his demise. How do we checkmate the king? Queen to b3 is check, but he can move in the corner. We can checkmate him in one move here. A4 is also check, but he can move away. B2, exactly. Now, this is an interesting study that I've been doing in my brain. So it's not an official study, but there seems to be a psychological aversion to moving the queen directly in front of the king. And that aversion makes sense because people don't want to lose their queen. This is where fundamentals come in. But if you know that a king can never put himself in check, and you know that your king is protecting this square, then there's no aversion to putting your queen directly in front of the king. But you have to be aware of that psychological aversion that you have because your students have it too. I see students time and time again get to this position and not know how to finish it off. All right, so you have to be aware of that aversion and know that if your king is protecting, you can put your king right in front of the opposing king. You put, sorry, excuse me, you can put your queen right in front of the opposing king, and there's nothing he can do. He can't take because that's an illegal move. So just be aware of that aversion and teach that to your students. Exactly. All right. So for those of you who are here, was I able to effectively teach that skill to you? And do you think you can teach that to your students? We also have a video about it on our YouTube page, so don't be afraid to watch that. All right, the king and rook is also very similar. But it's a little bit more difficult because the rook is not as powerful as the queen. But the same thing applies, except instead of using the night shadow, we're just going to use the box method. So as we know, the king is already trapped. All the pieces are trapped within a box of 64 squares. No matter how hard they try, they can't move outside of the board. Our goal is to take that 64 square box and make it smaller and smaller and smaller. And we do that by using our rook. So for instance, this simple move here takes away all of these squares from the black king. The black king can never move to these squares. And the reason is because the king is trapped within this box right here. No matter how hard he tries, he can't cross those lines because the rook attacks all of those lines. So rule number one is create a box. Rule number two is keep your king and rook close to each other so that your rook can never be taken. And rule number three is make the box smaller and smaller and smaller until the king is forced in the corner. Rule number four is checkmate. All right, so let's use our skills. This situation here, where should we move our rook? No worries, Miss Myers. I'll see you soon. Correct. D6. We made the box smaller. This red wall is shifting, and we are making the king feel very uneasy. The king moves here. We move here because we can shield him with our king as well. Where should we move if the king moves here? Well, we can't move to c5 because that would be breaking the rule. The kings would be adjacent to each other. We would be putting ourselves in check. But we can move our rook to d5. Exactly. All right, now this is the hardest move to see because our rook is in the ideal place it can go, right? If I move it this way, the king escapes. And if I move my king away, he takes my rook. So this position here is the hardest move to see. What do you think we should do in this position? King to d6, exactly. This is called a waiting move. This is important because it forces, yeah, good job. It forces, yes, yay you, good job. It forces black to make a choice. If he moves to one of these squares, we make the box smaller. If he moves straight back, what do you think we should do? E6 is not a bad move, king to e6, but it's not really backing the king into a corner. We want to back the king into a corner with one of our pieces. Because remember, we're trying to force the king into the corner. In this case, we're trying to force the king into this corner because of where the box currently is. Right, we can't move rook to d4 because the rook will be taken. But we can move our king straight up. And you see how our king and rook are working together to back the king away? See that? So king is forced to back up again, either here, here, or here. If he moves here, what can we do? Yeah, rook to d4, or even move the king up again. Either one. Let's check out rook to d4. Then he'll attack the rook, and we get to this position again. What's the right move in this position? Right. We do the waiting move, which forces him to make a decision. Then we make the box smaller. He attacks the rook. We simply move up, make the box smaller. Keep making progress. As long as I keep my rook here. Now you're trapped in this little tiny cute box here. There's no way to defend against it if you have the lone king, Kelly. You just have to hope your opponent makes a mistake. This is a win 100 out of 100 times if you know what you're doing. Right. If you know the technique, you will never lose this game. And I like to do a demonstration. Everyone knows computers are the strongest chess players in the world. So what I do sometimes is I play this end game against the strongest computers in the world, and you win every time. And it's not because you're special or anything. It's because you know the technique. It's a winning end game 100% of the time. King moves back. Where do you move? Correct. Rook c2. Now we're getting very close. King moves over. Where should we move? Unfortunately, king to c1 leads to stalemate because he's not in check, but he has nowhere to move. So we have to bring our king the other direction to allow him to move to b1. What do you think we should do in this situation here? b2. All right, so we currently have him trapped in this box here, but if we move to b2, now he can escape. He can run for his life. So we don't want to do that. What else can we do? King b2, remember kings can never stand next to each other. They can't be that close, so that would break the rules. But we can do king b3, right, which forces him in the corner. What do we move here? Exactly. You want to check, not a stalemate. Again, we can't move king to b2 because that would break the rule. Kings can't be that close. I'll be putting myself in check. No worries. It's okay. That's why we're learning. So what else can we do? Rook to a2 again would let the king escape, right? Because now he can go run away. He can go run away. He won't run away for very long, but he can run away. I will not tell you. I will let you think. Rook to c1. Exactly. Good job. Takes away all the squares here. The king takes away the other two. That's checkmate. Good job. So these basic checkmates, king and queen versus king, king and rook versus king, this will win you a lot of games. All right? So to end with some information about us, we are the Orlando Chess Club and Development Center. We meet from 6 to 9. I got to update this. Let me update this. We meet from 6 to 9, and we meet at Valencia in Winter Park. Our ultimate goal, it's all pattern recognition. It'll come with time. Our ultimate goal is to have our own chess club one day, whether that be a shared office space or whether that be a school that opens their door up to us and allows us to come and go, or whatever it may be. Our ultimate goal is to have our own club so that we can run tournaments, we can run trainings. We are called the Orlando Chess Club and Development Center for a reason. You know, with funding, we can help develop the talent that we have. We have so much talent that plays chess, but we don't have an actual system that can develop that talent. That's why we exist. We are trying to become that. And with a great system where kids can come play tournaments, play stronger opponents, they can go in our backyard every year at the Nationals, at Disney World, win trophies, Nationals. And so that's our goal. So if you or anyone you know that can help us with our goal, whether it be financially or office space or whatever it may be, tell them about us. We do most of the stuff that we do for free, whether it be these trainings, absolutely free, chess club nights free, whether it be, you know, volunteering at OCPS tournaments for free. Most of our stuff is free. We charge for coaching and private lessons, but we want to try to stay as free as we can. Our information is there. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. We have a website. Just make sure it's orlandochessclub.net, and there's our phone number as well. Yeah, definitely. I'll look into that for sure. But thank you for attending, Miss Kelly, and thank you everyone for watching the recording. It was fun to teach you all. If you have any questions, please let me know. Hey, it's my pleasure. My pleasure. Everyone have a great day. And if you have any questions, text me or email me at orlandochessclub@gmail.com. Let me write that on here. orlandochessclub@gmail.com. Bye, guys.